Hi, today we're going to talk about a method that can be used to help us solve quadratic equations, and that method is called completing the square. Right where you clicked on this video in the Google Classroom, right below it was a little tab to some notes on how to complete the square. And if you open that up, I scanned this page into that little tab. It might not be a bad idea to push pause here, print that off, and have it available to help us make reference to as we do these next few problems. So if you want to do that, go ahead and push pause, print it off, and then come on back. Okay? All right, welcome back. So if I look at this is going to take us step by step on how to go through this and solve an equation, a quadratic equation. And as you know, when we solve a quadratic equation, our goal is to get x by itself, or find the value of x that makes the equation true. Okay? I'm going to look at a couple of them here. I'm going to do right over here on the side. And here's the first problem I'm going to take a look at. If I had x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0. Okay, and there are 4 little steps here, and we're going to kind of go through it, all 4 of them, on the first problem or two, and then I'm going to see if you can find a little bit of a shortcut that you may be able to save some work a little, save some time. Okay, so here's the first one. If I look at step number 1, it says write the equation in the form x squared plus bx equals c. Okay, and what's special about that is only the x's are on one side and the constant is on the other side. And another thing to make note of is the leading coefficient is a 1. We don't want a number out in front out there. Well, if you look over here, there's nothing there, so it's a 1. Here are my x terms, but I want to move the 8 over to the other side. Okay, and because it's minus 8, I'm going to add it. So I'm going to do x squared plus 2x equals positive 8. Okay, there I've just completed step number 1. Okay. When I go to step number 2 here, it says we're going to take half of b. So we're going to take b, which is the number in front of x, which is my 2 in this case. I'm going to take half of it, square that number, so take half of it, square that number, and then add it to both sides. Okay, so here we go. Here's b, there's 2. Half of 2 is 1. Square that number, 1 squared is 1. And I'm going to add it to the left, and I'm going to add it to the right. Okay, and I can do that as long as I keep it balanced and do it to both sides. Okay, so here's what I have next. X squared plus 2x plus 1. And on the right-hand side, now I have a 9. Okay, we just completed step number 2. Half of b squared and add it to the other side. Okay, step number 3 here is we're going to factor the left-hand side. Okay, so what if I just factor the left? Okay, I'm going to get x and x, if you remember that. The factors of 1 are only 1 and 1. And I think if I put both 2 pluses in there, I get 1x and a 1x, I get 2x. And if you look closely, since these two are the same thing, I can write it as x plus 1 squared equals 9. Okay? And that's what I mean by write it in this form. When we do this completing the square stuff, these two things, when we factor, should always be exactly the same. Okay? And that way we can write it as a quantity squared. Okay, now we learned in a previous lesson, how do I solve for that x? It's being squared, but it's inside parentheses. And in order to get at this stuff inside the parentheses, I have to get rid of the stuff outside. I have to get rid of that 2. And the way I get rid of a square there is I'm going to square root both sides. Okay, and if I do that, the square and the square root cancel out. And I always get plus or minus when I do a square root, and the square root of 9 is 3. Okay, so I get x plus 1 equals plus or minus 3. Now to solve for x, I'm going to move the 1 over. Okay, I'm going to come up here so I have a little more room. X equals, it'd be negative 1 plus or minus 3. And notice there's 2 answers there. Okay? And I'm going to try to write them out separately. If I did negative 1 plus 3, the answer is 2. And negative 1 minus 3, I get negative 4. So there's 2 answers, positive 2 and negative 4. Okay, and what's nice about this one is when I do the square root to both sides, and this number right here is a perfect square, I'm going to get a nice number. Okay, and when I move the other number over, I can get 2 nice answers. Okay, but there's a little problem on helping us, or showing you how to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. Okay, we've tackled one, I'm going to try another one here. Okay, let's see if we can take a look at another one. Okay, how about this? What if I had x squared plus 8x, oops, yep, plus 5 equals 0. So what if I started it out there in standard form? Okay, as it says in step number 1, I need to get it so that just the x's are on the same side. I'm going to move my 5 over. X squared plus 8x equals negative 5. Okay, I'm going to take, for step 2 here now, take half of b, and b is 8, so half of it is 4. 4 squared is 16. So I'm adding 16 to both sides. And I'm just going to rewrite what I have. X squared plus 8x plus 16, and negative 5 plus 16 is 11. Okay. In step 3, I'm going to factor the left. I get x and x. The factors of 16 that give me 8 are going to be 4 and 4. Plus 4 and plus 4 equals 11. And since they're both the same thing, I can write that as x plus 4 squared equals 11. Okay? And before I go any further here, again, I want to just mention this shortcut and see if we can see it. What number ended up in the parentheses here? The 4. And where'd 4 come from? It came from half of our b. Okay, that's always going to be the case. Half of b ends up in the parentheses, but I still had to square that number and add it to the other side. And we'll maybe incorporate that shortcut on the next one. And we'll be able to skip this factoring step. Okay, but to keep solving for x, I'm going to square root both sides. They cancel out. And I get plus or minus whenever I square it. And the square root of 11. This time, the square root of 11 isn't a nice number. Okay? And it turns out it can't be simplified either, so let's just leave it. Okay? And last but not least, to get x by itself, I'm going to move the 4 over. And when I move it to the other side, I'm going to subtract 4. And the place we want to put that 4 is in front of the plus and the minus. It's going to be negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 11. Okay? And there's our grand finale answer right there. Okay? So I'm hoping that those 4 steps can talk you through it. Okay? We're going to try one more here. And maybe we'll try to incorporate that shortcut in there this time. And see if we can make it work. Okay? Let's see here. What if I had... Oops. Let's try x squared minus 6x equals 5. Let's try that. Okay, this one's starting out in the proper form. I have my x's on the same side, the coefficients 1, we're all good to go. Okay, so I'm going to do a little shortcut. If you guys remember, what number ends up inside those parentheses that we're going to square? That number came from half of b. Half of b is 3. And that's what ends up in the parentheses, half of 3. I'm sorry, half of 6, which is 3. But if I did it the other way, remember we still had to square that number and add it to the other side. 3 squared is 9. We always still have to balance it out. And if I add these together, I get 14. Okay? I don't know if you noticed this or not, but I kind of skipped that whole factoring step. Okay? And I can go right to here. Then I can square root both sides. They cancel out. Plus or minus the square root of 14. And I'm going to add my 3. Positive 3 on the other side, plus or minus the square root of 14. Okay, you don't have to use that shortcut, but a lot of people like it and makes things a little bit nicer, a little less work. So essentially kind of what we do is that we skip the factoring. Okay, and we just kind of get it, we eventually get it right to that form. Okay? All right, I'm going to go ahead to the screen here. Let's try this again once. Let's try this one. Okay, starting out in standard form. Okay, I need to get just the x's on one side. So this is here. I'm going to move the 2 over to the other side. And I'm going to subtract 2, so I end up with 2. Okay. If I use my little shortcut, what's going to go inside the parentheses is half of b. In this case, b is 10. Half of 10 is 5. it's going to be x minus 5 squared. But when I do that, I still have to add, I always have to add something to the other side, and it's going to be the square of that number. 5 squared is 25. And it's not negative 5 squared, but 5 squared. And if I add it to the other side here, I get 27. Okay? If I square root both sides, the square and the square root go away. And I get plus or minus the square root of 27. And I'm going to add my 5 over to the other side. And when I add that to the other side, I get x equals positive 5 plus or minus the square root of 27. Okay, now when we do these, we always have to check that radical part. Is that radical simplified as much as we possibly can? Well, again, in a previous lesson, we worked on simplifying radicals. And if you remember, if you looked at your factor sheet, 27 has a couple factors. And has one that's a perfect square. It'd be 9. 9 and 3. And 9 turns into a big 3. Okay? So actually, when I combine this all together and I simplify it, I get 5 plus or minus 3 square roots of 3 would be my grand finale answer. So again, we're going to have to continue to simplify radicals whenever we see them. Okay? Again, I'm hoping you can catch on to that little shortcut. It can save a little bit of work here. Okay? The last types of problems are these. Okay, these are a little bit different. And what's different about this one? I don't know if you look closely, but the thing that's different about this one is that there's a number in front of x, the x squared term. Okay, well eventually we're going to have to get rid of that. Okay, but here's what we're going to do first. We're still going to start out the same way. Let's just get our x's on the same side, and let's move the 2 over. So I have 2x squared minus 4x equals 6. And like I said on the sheet here, I'll back up a couple screens here. Oops. The coefficient has to be a 1. Well, what do we do if it's not a 1? Oops. Okay, the way we get rid of this 2 here is we're going to divide everything by 2. I can do that as long as I do it to everything. Okay, there goes those. They're gone away. Oh, they go away. Minus 2x equals 3. Okay, now it's in the proper form. And now I can continue to complete the square. Again, if I use my little shortcut, what's going to end up in the parentheses is half of b. Half of 2 is 1. So x minus 1 in the parenthesis. But then I square that number. 1 squared is 1, and that's what gets added to the other side. And altogether on the other side, oops, I didn't want to write a 3 here. Altogether on the other side, I get 3 plus 1 is 4. Okay? And then I can square root to solve it. X minus 1 equals plus or minus 2. And then I can add my 1 again. So I get x equals 1 plus or minus 2. Okay? And now because this 4 was a perfect square, it gave us a nice number, we can actually go one step further and write 2 nice answers. 1 plus 2 is 3, and 1 minus 2 is negative 1. So these are the 2 exact answers that we want. If they are, like I said, if it's a perfect square, we should be able to go one step further. Okay, good. But again, the thing that was different about that one is it had a coefficient. We just got the x's on the same side, and then we divided by that coefficient. Okay? Let's try this one. Okay, it looks a little bit bigger and fancier. Okay, oh man. Okay, well let's try this. Here are my x's. I'm going to add 27. So 9x squared plus 18x. And if I add 27 there, I get 23. Okay. I have to get rid of the 9, so I'm going to divide by 9. They cancel out. I get 2x. And over there, I get 23 ninths. Oh man, it's a fraction. Okay, that's okay. Okay, it's in the proper form. I got my x's on the left. If I do my little shortcut, let's figure out what's going to go in the parentheses. It's half of 2, which is 1 again. I'm going to get x plus 1. Then I have to square that number. 1 squared is 1, and I have to add it to the other side. Well, on the other side over here now, how do you add those? Okay, number one, you can use your calculator. Or number two, you could find a common denominator. Now, 1 is the same as 9/9. Okay? And if I do 23/9 plus 9/9, I get 32/9. Okay, still got a fraction, that's okay again. No worries. Okay? Let's continue solving it here. If I do my square root, I get x plus 1, because they cancel out, equals plus or minus square root of 32/9. And a while back when we did square roots, the way I can do this is I can break them apart into two. I can break it apart into the square root of 32 over the square root of 9. I can separate them. Okay? Well, good news for us, the square root of 9 is 3. Okay? And if I go one more step here to move my 1 over, it'd be, if I move it over here, it's going to be negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 32 over 3. Okay? Now, let's take a look at that answer for a second. Is the radical simplified as much as we possibly can do? Not quite. Okay, but from previous times here, we talked about simplifying the radical, and we used our factor sheet. And if you look at your factor sheet for 32, we're looking for the black ones on the factor sheet. And you'll see two numbers on there that are in black, 16 and 2. The reason they're in black is because 16 is a perfect square. It's 4 square roots of 2. Okay? And I get negative 1 plus or minus 4 square roots of 2 over 3. Okay? Now that's one possible version of the answer, the radical simplified. Yeah. Okay, you can kind of see it says two different parts. However, if you check your answer in the back of the book, that's technically over 1. What they do in the back of the book is they make this into common denominators, and it's going to look something like this. To make this become a 3, they times it by 3. So it becomes negative 3 plus or minus 4 square roots of 2 all over 3. Okay? Either answer is perfectly fine, okay, but I think this is what it looks like in the back of the book. But please know that this is the exact same thing as that. Okay? Either one is perfectly fine, but just make sure you simplify the radical as much as possible. Okay, you're not going to see too many fractions. Okay, things are going to be kind of nice for us. Okay, here's our last one that we're going to take a look at. Okay, it's also a special one, so it'd be a good idea to tune in, and might not be a bad idea to write it down as we do it. Okay, well, good news, the coefficient is just a 1. Bad news is I got to move the 20 over. Okay, so let's try x squared plus 8x equals negative 20. Okay, I'm going to do my shortcut. In my parentheses is going to go half of b, which is 4. Half of 8 is 4, so x plus 4. If I square it, 4 squared is 16. So I'm going to add 16 to the other side. Negative 20 plus 16 is negative 4. Okay, so we're doing the same thing. Okay. To solve for x here, I need to get rid of the square, and I can do that by square rooting both sides. The square and the square root go away. Plus or minus the square root of negative 4. So this is what's special about this one. How do we do square roots of negative numbers? Well, if you remember from the previous lesson, the square root of a negative number is going to have an I in it. Okay? And good news for us, this 4 is a perfect square. It's going to be a 2, but it's going to have it be a 2i. It's going to have an I with it. And last but not least, I move my 4 over by subtracting 4, and I get x equals negative 4 plus or minus 2i. And notice all of these have had two answers. They all have a plus and a minus. Okay, we cannot combine those because these are not like terms. That doesn't have an I in it. So it just stays two separate pieces, just like that. Okay? So again, that's a little lesson on completing the square. Okay? And your assignment, as it says back on Google Classroom, is to completing the square worksheet. And there's some special directions listed with that in terms of what your answers are going to be like. All right, thanks for tuning in. Good luck.